Welcome to the Current Issues in Immunization Net Conference series. I'm Andrew Kroger. I'm a medical officer in the Immunization Services Division of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Diseases, or NCIRD, at the CDC, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. To participate in today's program, all you will need is an internet connection. It is June 1st, 2016, and today, Ms. Donna Weaver, nurse educator in the Communication and Education Branch, Immunization Services Division in NCIRD CDC, will discuss principles of vaccination as presented in the CDC textbook, Epidemiology and the Prevention of Vaccine-Preventable Diseases, also known as the Pink Book, whose 13th edition was published last year. At the conclusion of this session, the participant will be able to, 1, describe the different forms of immunity, 2, describe the different types of vaccines, 3, for each vaccine-preventable disease, identify those for whom routine immunization is recommended, 4, for each vaccine-preventable disease, describe characteristics of the vaccine used to prevent the disease, 5, describe an emerging immunization issue, 6, locate resources relevant to current immunization practice, and 7, implement disease detection and prevention healthcare services, for example, smoking cessation, weight reduction, diabetes screening, blood pressure screening, immunization services, to prevent health problems and maintain health. Continuing education, or CE credit, is available only through the CDC ATSDR Training and Continuing Education Online system at www.2a.cdc.gov/TCE online. If you are watching this version live, CE credit for the session will expire on July 5th, 2016. If you are watching the Enduring Archive version, CE credit for the session expires on June 1st, 2018. When obtaining CE, you will be required to provide a verification code. Watch and listen for the verification code during the course. Verification codes will not be given outside of this presentation. CDC, our planners, and our presenters wish to disclose they have no financial interests or other relationships with the manufacturers of commercial products, suppliers of commercial services, or commercial supporters. Presentations will not include any discussion of the unlabeled use of a product or a product under investigational use. CDC does not accept any commercial support. A list of resources will be available for Principles of Vaccination, and the webpage for that is www.cdc.gov/vaccines/pinkbook/pb1.asp. If you have a question during this presentation, please type your question into the Q&A pod, which is a space in the corner of your screen. I will collect these questions during the presentation, and then we will address them during the question and answer period, which will follow Ms. Weaver's presentation. I will now turn the microphone over to Ms. Weaver. You may begin.
Thank you, Dr. Kroger, and good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank you for tuning in. As Dr. Kroger said, our topic today is Principles of Vaccination. Now, if you're following along in the Pink Book, the slides I'm using are similar to the ones in the first chapter. And these slides are also posted for download. Now, as I'm sure you know, immunization practice is complicated and getting more complicated every year. New vaccines are introduced and need to be integrated into the schedule, and recommendations sometimes change for existing vaccines. And all of this can make it easy to get confused. So to understand how vaccines work, I'm going to start with some basic information about how the immune system functions. A healthy immune system is one that can recognize and eliminate foreign or non-self material from the body and ignore everything else that belongs there. In this program, we're going to refer to immunity as protection from infectious diseases. So the immune system is able to recognize and eliminate the infectious organism and prevent infection with it in the future. Now, this is done with the help of antibodies that are specific to the infectious organism or a group of infectious organisms that are closely related. Infectious substances are typically viruses, bacteria, or toxins produced by the organism. They can be live or inactivated. They're referred to as antigens that are capable of stimulating an immune response. So the antigen stimulates the immune system to mount a defense by developing or generating antibodies. Now, the way I remembered this in nursing school was to think of the antigen as an antibody generator. An antibody is a protein molecule, also referred to as immunoglobulin. Antibodies are produced by B cells, and B cells are a type of lymphocyte or white blood cell that develops in the bone marrow, and that's why they're called B cells. So an antibody will bind to an antigen in kind of a lock and key type of mechanism, or like putting pieces of a puzzle together. This helps neutralize the antigen so it can't multiply. Then other cells in the immune system, like T cells, which I'll discuss in a few minutes, can destroy and remove the antigen from the body. There are two arms to the immune system. One is humoral immunity. Humoral immunity is essentially the production of antibodies that specifically target a certain antigen or group of antigens. So the antibodies are circulating in the blood or humor. So that's why it's referred to as humoral immunity. The other arm of the immune system is cell-mediated immunity, and this involves T cells, also known as T lymphocytes. T cells are so called because they mature in the thymus gland, which is located behind the sternum or breastbone. Now, some T cells help the B cells, but some work with cells like macrophages and other killer cells to engulf and destroy the invading antigen. So you can have helper T cells and killer T cells. The ideal is to have both humoral and cell-mediated immunity working together, but it's possible to have antibodies develop independent of T cells through humoral immunity. Now, that was really a very simplified explanation of what is a very remarkable and complex immune system. But the main things I want you to remember are the key components of antigens, antibodies, B cells, and T cells. Now, in addition to two arms of the immune system, there are two ways to acquire immunity, either actively or passively, and you can have both at the same time. So let's look at passive immunity first. Passive immunity involves the transfer of antibodies from a human or animal to another human. These antibodies provide temporary protection that typically disappears or wanes after several weeks or months. And this type of antibody is extremely important to infants who receive antibodies through the placenta in the last 1 to 2 months before birth. So a full-term infant will have the same antibodies as the mother to help protect the infant until it can be vaccinated and make its own antibodies. So let's look at an animation that describes passive immunity.
One type of immunity is passive immunity. With passive immunity, a person receives antibodies from another person rather than producing them. The most common type of passive immunity occurs when a fetus receives its mother's antibodies across the placenta. A full-term infant is born with antibodies against the same diseases to which the mother is immune. As the infant grows, the maternally acquired antibodies circulate throughout the body. Since the infant did not actively produce the antibodies, the level declines with time. If the infant is exposed to a disease for which it has maternally acquired antibodies, the antibodies will recognize and help to eliminate the invading organism, just as it would if the infant were immune from infection. One potential problem with passive immunity is that the maternally acquired antibodies cannot tell the difference between disease-causing virus and live vaccine virus. So, if the infant receives a live virus vaccine while maternal antibodies are still circulating, the antibodies will recognize the vaccine virus and help eliminate it from the body, preventing active immunity from occurring. By the time the infant is about a year old, all maternal antibodies will have disappeared. Now the infant is susceptible to infection with either the disease-causing or vaccine form of the organism. Because there are no circulating antibodies to interfere, live vaccines given to the infant will confer active immunity. Maternally acquired immunity is only one type of passive immunity. Injection with immune globulin or disease-specific globulin or transfusion of blood products are other ways of conferring passive immunity. But passive immunity, no matter how acquired, is always temporary. Active immunity, either from infection with the disease-causing form of the organism or through vaccination, is the only way to become permanently immune to disease.
Now, there are other sources of passive immunity in addition to maternal antibodies. Blood and many blood products contain antibodies. Homologous pooled human antibody, which is also known as immune globulin or Ig, is just as the name implies. Homologous means the antibodies are derived from the same species, that being humans. So there are 5 classes of antibodies, including IgA, IgD, IgG, IgM, and IgE. IgG antibody is the most common type of antibody found in blood. So these are pooled IgG antibodies from thousands of adult donors here in the U.S. Now, this pooled antibody product contains IgG antibodies to many different antigens. And since there's a large pool of people in the U.S. with antibody to hepatitis A and measles, Ig is used primarily to provide antibodies to people who are not immune and have been exposed to Hep A or measles. And this is known as post-exposure prophylaxis. But they're also used for treatment of certain congenital and immunoglobulin deficiencies, or more simply put, when someone is born with part of the body's immune system missing or not functioning properly. Another type of antibody is homologous human hyperimmune globulin. The source is donated plasma from humans who have a high level of a particular antibody. But these products also contain other antibodies that are present in the plasma. Hyperimmune globulins are used for post-exposure prophylaxis for several diseases. H-big for post-exposure to hepatitis B virus, RIG or RIG for rabies, TIG or TIG for tetanus, Varizig for varicella, and I wonder if you know what VIG is used for. Well, it's vaccinia immune globulin that can be used to treat severe adverse reactions to smallpox vaccine. Now, heterologous hyperimmune serum, also known as antitoxin, is produced from a different species, that is animals, usually horses. So this would be an equine antitoxin. The serum contains antibodies to only one antigen. In the U.S., equine antitoxin is available for treatment of botulism and diphtheria. One downside associated with antitoxin is serum sickness. Now, this is when the body has an immune reaction to the foreign protein that's similar to an allergic reaction. Some older people may have experienced serum sickness from tetanus equine antitoxin, which was used primarily before World War II. And those persons may report being allergic to tetanus vaccine, not realizing that actually what they had was serum sickness from the equine antitoxin. But we now use tetanus immune globulin or TIG made from human antibodies rather than tetanus antitoxin. And there's no horse protein in TIG or in any of the tetanus-containing vaccines that are currently used. Antibodies from human sources are polyclonal, meaning they contain many different kinds of antibodies. Some are in more quantities than others. But scientists came up with a way to isolate and indefinitely grow single B cells, which then led to the development of specific or monoclonal antibodies. A monoclonal antibody contains antibody to only one antigen or a closely related group of antigens. And monoclonal antibodies are used in the diagnosis or treatment of certain cancers and prevention of transplant rejection, and also the treatment of certain autoimmune diseases and infectious diseases. Now, one monoclonal antibody product you may be familiar with is palivizumab. The trade name is Synagis. This is an antibody product available for the prevention of respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, infection in infants. There's been a lot of confusion about this product. Although it's used to prevent severe RSV disease, it contains only RSV antibody. It's not a vaccine. It's a ready-made antibody product that provides passive immunity. The good news is that since it's a monoclonal antibody, it won't interfere with the immune response to vaccines, especially live vaccines like MMR and varicella. Now, we'll talk more about this in the sessions on general recommendations. So now I'm going to move on to the other way of acquiring immunity, and that's active immunity. Active immunity is the best type of immunity. Sometimes people refer to this as natural immunity, and it's produced by the person's own immune system, and it's usually long-lasting, sometimes a lifetime. So let's look at an animation about active immunity.
The first event leading to immunity is exposure of a susceptible person to an infectious agent, in this case, a virus. Because the person is not immune, the virus is able to replicate and spreads throughout the body. As the viruses spread, some are captured by special antigen-presenting cells, such as B cells. The B cell engulfs the virus, disassembles it into smaller parts, and presents some of the viral parts on its surface. The viral antigens presented by the B cell attract another key cell of the immune system, a T cell, shown here in yellow. The T cell controls many functions of the immune system. It sends chemical signals to activate the B cell. Each activated B cell then begins to divide. This process is known as clonal expansion because each daughter B cell is a clone, identical to the original activated cell. Many of these millions of activated B cells will transform into plasma cells and begin to produce protein molecules called antibodies. Antibodies attach to the invading virus, interfere with its ability to produce more viruses, and facilitate destruction of the virus by other cells of the immune system. The combined forces of the antibodies and other components of the immune system eliminate the invading virus from the body and confer active immunity. The antibodies and some of the activated B cells, called memory cells, remain after the virus has been eliminated, making the person immune to that virus. Active immunity can result either from infection with the disease-causing form of the organism or through vaccination, and will persist for years, probably for the life of the person. The entire process from infection to elimination of virus usually takes 1 to 2 weeks, but it can take longer depending on the organism. Months or years later, another exposure to the virus may occur. The circulating antibodies will recognize the virus, and memory cells will rapidly produce more antibody. Because of the antibody and other components of the immune system, the virus will be unable to replicate enough to cause disease. The exposed person is usually unaware that the exposure even occurred.
Now, there are two ways to acquire active immunity. One is by being infected with the disease-causing form of the organism. So obvious examples would be the protection or immunity that develops after infection with measles virus or the chickenpox virus. Second infections can occur, but they're not common if the person has a healthy immune system. And if second infections do occur, symptoms are usually mild, or the infection is what we call subclinical, and you really don't experience any symptoms or realize that you've been infected. After the initial infection, there are memory B cells in the blood and bone marrow that remain there for many years. So if there is a re-exposure to the infectious agent, these memory cells go into action to produce antibody and eliminate the antigen. Now, the good news is that active immunity can also be acquired with vaccines without getting the actual disease or the uncomfortable symptoms or the potential complications, which sometimes can be serious or even deadly. Vaccination is a way of stimulating the immune system when exposed to a live, weakened form of the organism that does not cause disease in someone with a normal immune system, or when exposed to an inactivated form of the pathogen or disease-causing agent. The vaccine delivers this weakened or inactivated antigen that induces an immune response that's similar to the response to natural infection. Now, many vaccines also produce memory B cells. This immunologic memory allows for what is referred to as an anamnestic response. In other words, when there is a re-exposure to the antigen, the memory cells begin to produce antibodies that go into action against the antigen. There are many factors that influence a person's immune response to a vaccine. One is the presence of maternal antibodies, which have more effect on live vaccines because they cannot tell the difference between the disease-causing antigen and the live weakened antigen. This is why only oral live vaccine is administered during the first year of life, because the immune response is not affected by circulating maternal antibodies. Other factors that can affect the immune response to a vaccine are the nature and amount or dose of antigen in the vaccine, the route of administration, whether an adjuvant is present to improve the vaccine's ability to provoke an immune response, and whether the vaccine has been stored and handled properly. And by handled, I also mean administering it properly. There are also factors about the person receiving the vaccine that influence the immune response to the vaccine. And these include the person's age, their nutritional status, their genetics, and if they have a coexisting disease. There are two basic classifications of vaccines. The characteristics are different and determine how the vaccines are used. A live attenuated vaccine contains a weakened form of what we call the wild disease-causing virus or bacterium. An inactivated vaccine contains inactivated or dead virus or bacterium or a fraction of the organism. Now, in order to simplify some of the principles of vaccination, we've developed a few general rules. So if you're following along in the pink book, you'll find these general rules in boxes in the text in the chapters on principles of vaccination and general recommendations. Now, here's the first general rule. The more similar a vaccine is to the natural disease, the better the immune response to the vaccine. And that makes sense. Since disease-induced immunity is generally effective and long-lasting, then the closer we can approximate that process with the vaccine, the better the protection from the vaccine. So from this rule, you would expect that live vaccines would have some advantages, since infectious diseases are caused by live organisms. So let's look at an animation about live attenuated vaccines.
The events that produce immunity with a live attenuated vaccine are almost identical to those which lead to immunity following infection with the disease-causing form of the organism. The two main differences are that exposure is intentional, usually through injection of the virus, and that the virus is attenuated or weakened, so it does not cause illness. Since the person is not immune, the vaccine virus is able to replicate and spreads throughout the body. The vaccine virus is very similar to natural disease virus, so the immune system cannot tell them apart. B cells and other antigen-presenting cells engulf and disassemble the virus and present viral antigens on their surface. The viral antigens are recognized by a T cell, shown here in yellow. The T cell signals the B cell to activate. The activated B cells begin to divide, producing millions of identical daughter B cells. Many of these B cells transform into plasma cells and produce antibodies directed against the vaccine virus. As with infection with the disease-causing form of the virus, the antibody attaches to the vaccine virus and facilitates its destruction by other components of the immune system. This leads to elimination of the virus from the body. The antibody and memory B cells produced in response to the vaccine virus infection will persist for many years after the vaccine virus has been eliminated. Because the antibodies cannot distinguish between vaccine virus and disease virus, the person is now immune, probably for life, to infection with a disease-causing form of the organism. So, if months or years later an exposure to disease virus occurs, the antibodies will recognize the virus and facilitate its elimination by other components of the immune system. No disease will result from the exposure.
So the wild virus or bacterium is weakened by repeated passage in culture media. Well, what that means is the wild organism is grown in one environment or culture medium, and then another and another and so on until it's weak enough that disease won't occur, but the immune response can still occur. You know, it took almost 10 years to transform the wild measles virus that was obtained from a child with measles disease in 1954 before it could be used to make vaccine. Now, an important characteristic of a live attenuated vaccine is that the organism can still replicate or multiply to produce the immune response, just as the wild organism would do. Since the response is so similar to the immune response produced by natural infection, a live attenuated vaccine will produce an immune response in most recipients with one dose. Now, there are exceptions. Live oral vaccines are not delivered by injection, but rather into the gut, so they require additional doses, as was the case with the oral polio vaccine, and now with the rotavirus vaccine, and also one of the typhoid vaccines. Also, there's a small percentage of vaccine recipients that don't respond to the first dose, but most of these people will respond to a second dose. Now, this graph illustrates an individual's response to a dose of live vaccine. The Y or vertical axis represents the antibody level, and the pink line represents the antibody level that is protective. The X or horizontal axis represents the number of doses administered. So you can see that after one dose of the live vaccine, a positive response to the vaccine, which is represented by the gold columns, is well above the protective pink line. And administering additional doses really doesn't improve the antibody level that much. And if you look out further through time, there's very little waning of the immune response. That gold column stays well above the pink protective line. This graph, on the other hand, looks at the population response to a live vaccine. The Y or vertical axis represents the percent of the population or community that is immune, and the X or horizontal axis represents the number of doses administered. So just as with the individual response, you see that the population or community immune level is quite high after just one dose and rises gradually as a small percentage of those who did not respond to the first dose receive a second dose. And a third dose shows really little difference. Now, what that second illustration was addressing is what we refer to as herd or community immunity. This slide represents 3 communities. In these communities, blue figures represent people who are not immunized, but they're still healthy. Yellow figures represent people who are immunized and healthy. And the red figures represent those unfortunate people who are not immunized, they're sick, and they're contagious. The first community, as shown on the top left, initially does not have very many sick people, but there are lots of susceptible people, most of whom become sick and contagious, as you see on the right. Now, in the left illustration of the middle community, there still are not very many sick people, but there are also some healthy immunized people. But there aren't very many, so on the right you can see there's still a lot of disease spreading. And last, but certainly not least, is the illustration of a community with a high immunization coverage rate. Although there's still the same initial number of sick people on the left, there's very little disease on the right because the spread of the disease is contained. Now this is really, again, a very simplified illustration of herd immunity. The herd immunity threshold, or the proportion of the population that must be immune to stop disease transmission, varies by disease, such as how contagious it is and how it's transmitted. Now, there are some things that we need to be aware of with live vaccines. Even though they're weakened and do not cause disease or anything more than a mild adverse reaction in someone with a healthy immune system, they can cause severe or fatal reactions in people who are immunodeficient, whether that's due to the fact that they have a disease or some medication they're taking, or if they're under some treatment like receiving radiation or chemotherapy. A person who is immunodeficient may not be able to mount an effective immune response and develop a level of antibodies that will stop the replication or multiplication of the vaccine virus. And it's also theoretically possible for the live attenuated virus to revert to the disease-causing form. This very rarely occurs, but it is what happened with the oral polio virus that resulted in some cases of vaccine-associated paralytic polio, or VAP. So that's why we don't use the oral polio virus vaccine in the U.S. anymore, just the inactivated. It's also possible for circulating antibody to interfere with the immune response to a vaccine. As I mentioned earlier, and it was also pointed out in the video, circulating antibodies, whether they're maternal antibodies or from one of those other products I mentioned, they cannot tell the difference between the wild organism and the attenuated organism. So it's really important to conduct thorough screening before administering a dose of vaccine, because this will help prevent vaccine failure because of the presence of circulating antibodies that can interfere with the immune response, or because of a severe allergy, or because of a serious or fatal reaction in someone who's immunodeficient. Now, another important strategy is to be sure that the vaccine is stored and handled according to your protocols, and also for administering the vaccine correctly. Their live vaccines are fragile, and they have to be stored and handled according to the manufacturer's recommendations, and they have to be administered correctly in order to work as they should, to get an optimal immune response. Now, there are currently several live attenuated viral vaccines available. The measles, mumps, rubella, or MMR vaccine, varicella and zoster vaccines, yellow fever, rotavirus, LAIV, the intranasal influenza vaccine, the smallpox or vaccinia vaccine, and like I said, the oral polio vaccine, which is still used in other countries. Now, the only live attenuated bacterial vaccine used in the U.S. for vaccination is oral typhoid vaccine. The BCG tuberculosis vaccine is not routinely used to protect against tuberculosis in the U.S. It's actually used to treat early stage bladder cancer. So now let's take a look at inactivated vaccines. The virus or bacterium is inactivated with heat or chemicals such as formalin, or both. There are two main groups of inactivated vaccines: those that contain the whole inactivated virus or bacterium, and a large second group which is referred to as fractional vaccines. Fractional vaccines only contain the pieces of the organism that will induce an immune response. And among the fractional vaccines, most of them are protein-based, such as subunit vaccines and toxoids. But some fractional vaccines are polysaccharide based, and they can either be pure polysaccharide or conjugated polysaccharide, which means they've been joined to a protein. So let's look at the last animation about inactivated vaccines.
The events which produce immunity to inactivated vaccine are similar to those leading to immunity following infection with the disease-causing form of the organism or vaccination with live attenuated vaccine. The person is injected with inactivated antigen, which can be a whole inactivated virus or fragments of a killed virus or bacterium. Since the antigen is dead, it cannot reproduce. So, larger quantities of inactivated vaccine antigen must be injected to stimulate an immune response. As with infection or vaccination with live vaccines, the inactivated antigen is captured and ingested by B cells and other antigen-presenting cells. The B cell processes the antigen and presents it on its surface. These antigens are recognized by a T cell. The T cell signals the B cell to activate. The B cells divide just as they do after infection with the disease-causing form of the organism or after receipt of live attenuated vaccine. Many will transform into plasma cells and then produce antibody directed against the vaccine antigen. Antibodies attach to the vaccine antigen, leading to its elimination from the body. Unlike infection with the disease-causing form of the organism or vaccination with live vaccines, a single dose of inactivated vaccine may not confer immunity. Only a small amount of antibody is produced, and it may disappear quickly. Additional doses may be needed to boost the immune response. A second dose of antigen, usually given within a few months of the first, causes a similar response. More antibody is produced, which attaches to the vaccine antigen and facilitates its elimination by other components of the immune system. This time, more antibodies remain, but long-lasting immunity still may not be conferred. One or more additional doses may be required to increase the antibodies to a protective level, but even this protection can gradually decline over time. An additional booster dose may be needed years after the primary series to ensure that the antibody level remains protective. While antibodies remain, the person is immune to the disease-causing form of the virus or bacterium. If an exposure to the disease organism occurs, the antibodies will recognize and help to eliminate it. Usually, there is no illness from the exposure. Illness may occur, but it is usually less severe than in an unvaccinated person.
Now, a key message in this video was that unlike live vaccines, inactivated vaccines cannot replicate or multiply. And there's no way inactivated vaccines can result in infection from the antigen in the vaccine, even in immunodeficient persons. So, in other words, the inactivated flu vaccine cannot cause flu. And inactivated vaccines are less affected by circulating antibodies than live vaccines. So maternal antibodies have little or no effect on the immune response to the vaccine. And when necessary, an inactivated vaccine can be administered at the same time as an immune globulin. An example is the administration of HBIG and Hep B vaccine at the same time in separate sites to an infant born to a mother who's hepatitis B surface antigen positive. The ready-made antibodies in the immune globulin provide protection through passive immunity until the baby can mount an active immune response to the hepatitis B vaccine. Now, the amount of antigen from a dose of inactivated vaccine is fixed. Since there's no replication, multiple doses are required before a protective antibody level is reached. And the immune response is primarily humoral, meaning antibodies. There's little, if any, cell-mediated immunity. The antibody titer or level of antibody will decline with time, and periodic booster doses may be required. Now, unlike the graph that I showed earlier for live vaccines, the antibody level is not usually at a protective level after a single dose with inactivated vaccines. The first dose primes the immune system, and then it takes usually at least 2 to 3 more doses before a protective antibody level is reached. Then, as this last column shows, the antibody level begins to wane. An example would be the DTaP series. That's why it's so important for pregnant women to receive their Tdap dose and pass on those maternal antibodies to their baby, and for parents to understand the need to continue the vaccination series as recommended, because one dose of Tdap vaccine does not protect a young infant against pertussis. Now, the population response to vaccination with an inactivated vaccine also looks very different than it did for a live vaccine. It takes several doses for each person before a high percentage of the population is immune and there's a good barrier of protection within the community. Inactivated whole virus vaccines available in the U.S. include inactivated polio, hepatitis A, and rabies. Inactivated whole bacterial vaccines include the whole cell pertussis vaccine, killed typhoid, cholera, and plague vaccines. Now, these inactivated whole bacterial vaccines and the whole influenza viral vaccine are now only of historical interest since none of them are used in this country. Some vaccines can be made using only certain proteins from the organism that will produce the immune response. Subunit vaccines include hepatitis B, influenza, acellular pertussis, human papillomavirus, and anthrax. Diphtheria and tetanus vaccines are made from toxins produced by the organisms. The toxins are inactivated and then referred to as toxoids. Some vaccines are made from polysaccharide organisms. Polysaccharides are complex sugars that make up the outer coat of certain bacteria, most notably the meningococcal, pneumococcal, and Haemophilus families. The polysaccharide coat is important not only in the development of disease, but also in the development of immunity. So you would think that making a vaccine using this outer coat would be fairly straightforward. Just purify the polysaccharide and put it in a vial. And basically, that's how pure polysaccharide vaccines are made. But there's a catch. The immune response to a pure polysaccharide vaccine is typically T-cell independent. In other words, these vaccines stimulate B cells without the assistance of T helper cells. But polysaccharide vaccines don't really induce an immune response in children younger than 2 years of age, most likely because their immune systems are still immature. And repeat doses usually do not cause a good booster response. Also, IgM antibody is the predominant class of antibody that's produced. There's little IgG antibody. Now, IgM antibody has less functional activity than IgG. IgM antibody is the immediate antibody that is produced by the immune system when exposed to an antigen, but it doesn't last as long as IgG antibody, and it doesn't bind as well to the antigen as the IgG antibody. But there is good news, and that's that polysaccharide vaccines can produce a better immune response when they can be chemically combined with a protein. And this is referred to as conjugation, which changes the immune response from T-cell independent to T-cell dependent. This increases the immune response in infants and the antibody booster response to multiple doses of vaccine. Now, there are both pure polysaccharide and conjugate pneumococcal and meningococcal vaccines. All HIP-containing vaccines are conjugate vaccines. and the inactivated injectable typhoid vaccine is a pure polysaccharide vaccine. There are some vaccines that are developed through genetic engineering technology, where a gene segment of the antigen is inserted into a different microbe or microorganism and then cultured on a large scale to make the vaccine. And these are referred to as recombinant vaccines. Vaccines that contain recombinant components are hepatitis B, the human papillomavirus vaccines, the RIV3 influenza vaccine, and the meningococcal B vaccines. Reassortant vaccines are vaccines made by mixing genetic material from more than one source. So the RV5 rotavirus vaccine contains genetic material from both human and bovine or cow strains of the virus. And each of the 4 influenza viruses in the live attenuated influenza vaccine contain gene segments from different viruses. Now, I want to briefly turn to the recommended immunization schedules. This is the recommended childhood and adolescent schedule for 2016. The recommended vaccines are in the far left column, and the ages at which various doses are recommended are across the top. And you'll notice that with the exception of the oral rotavirus vaccine, only inactivated vaccines are routinely recommended in the first year of life because of the presence of maternal antibodies. Now, there's an exception for MMR vaccine, which is recommended as young as 6 months of age for international travel. Maternal antibodies wane within a few months, and generally by 12 months of age, they will no longer interfere with the immune response to live attenuated vaccines like MMR and varicella. You can also see that the inactivated vaccines require between 3 and 5 doses for a complete series, whereas only 2 doses are recommended for MMR and varicella. The second doses of these vaccines, as I mentioned, are recommended to catch the small percentage of children who didn't respond to the first dose. Now, the yellow bars indicate the age range in which a particular dose is recommended. The green bars indicate the range of recommended ages for catch-up immunization. The purple bars indicate the range of recommended ages for high-risk groups for certain vaccines. Now, the blue bar indicates the range of recommended ages for non-high-risk groups that may receive vaccine based on individual clinical decision-making. And white means no recommendation. Now, there are 2 catch-up schedules shown on this slide. The top schedule is for children 4 months through 6 years of age who are behind schedule for 1 or more vaccine series, and the schedule below the heavy black line is for children 7 years through 18 years of age who are behind. These schedules should be used until the child is caught up and then return to the routine schedule for the remaining doses. Now, the timing of doses on this schedule is based on minimum ages and minimum intervals, which will be discussed more on the sessions for general recommendations. There are 2 adult schedules for persons 19 years of age and older. The same color coding convention used for the childhood and adolescent schedule is used for the recommended age ranges and for high-risk groups. This first adult schedule is based on recommended ages for particular vaccines if the person has no other evidence of immunity, or for recurring doses such as annual influenza vaccination and TD booster doses every 10 years. The second immunization schedule for adults is based on risk factors such as medical, lifestyle, or occupational risk for healthcare personnel. Now, the addition of the red bar indicates a contraindication for the live vaccines varicella, zoster, and MMR due to pregnancy or severe immunodeficiency. And now, before I take your questions, I want to ask you a question. Is the following statement true or false? Because pure polysaccharide vaccines, such as PPSV23 and MPSV, are T-cell independent, they provide good booster responses with subsequent doses. Now, is that a true statement or a false statement? Make your choices and then we'll see how the group did. Go ahead.
So this is Dr. Kroger speaking. I'll jump in here with the results of our poll. It looks like 62.6% of you said false to the question, because pure polysaccharide vaccines, for example, PPSV23 and MPSV, are T-cell independent. They provide good booster responses with subsequent doses. So a majority of you said false to that. 37.3% said true. The correct answer is false. A T-cell independent vaccine does not provide good booster responses with subsequent doses. It is the vaccines, such as the conjugate vaccines, that are T-cell dependent and recruit T-cells into the process, that generally have a better booster response. So you did well. A majority of you got that question correctly, 62.6%. So good job with that. And with that, I will move us on to our question and answer session. But first, before I do that, let me thank Donna for that presentation. And also, I would like to direct our viewers to the lower left-hand corner of your screen. You will see a pod that contains resources and other continuing education material. Now, I will provide more continuing education material at the end of the program, but I do want to right now take some of the questions that we have received during the program. And I'll start with the first question that we received. And Donna, I think if you can hear me, the question is, how can we convince staff that the inactivated flu vaccine does not give them the flu?
We get that question a lot. Well, the first thing is it's dead. It can't cause disease. Now, it's possible, as part of the immune response to the vaccine, that they may experience some, side effects, some mild, aching and not feeling so great for a day or two. And they could have a sore arm, that kind of thing. But that's just part of mounting the immune response. And it does take a couple of weeks before there's a full, protective immune response. Now, it is possible that they could have been infected before they got the vaccine. So they could have been incubating already, and actually, that's why they came down with the flu. And then sometimes, as hard as the experts try, sometimes the vaccine isn't always the best match that we hope for, as happened last year. The vaccine may drift somewhat, and then if that particular the virus may drift. So if that particular virus is what's circulating and it's not in the vaccine, then it's possible that it doesn't work as well as we had hoped. But the main thing is the vaccine itself cannot cause disease, and it's still the best protection that we have, because usually what happens is, even if someone does get the flu, it may be hopefully a milder case. So again, we strongly encourage anyone who can receive the vaccine to receive it.
Great, thank you, Donna. We received another question about the graph that you showed that showed protection levels for inactivated vaccines. There was a bar out to 5 years of protection. Is that generally 5 years after dose 2, 3, or 4 of the series?
Well, it really it depends on the vaccine. That was just a generalized example because some vaccine series are only 3 doses and frankly, like hepatitis B vaccine, even after 20, 25 years, we're still seeing that immunity is not waning, that there's that anamnestic response if there's an exposure. Um, so it varies by vaccine. Some do wane within a few years after the end of the series. Others, go on for many years before waning, if at all. So that really is going to vary by the particular organism and the vaccine.
Great, thank you. We got a lot of great questions coming in. Here's another one. The vaccination recommendations are very complicated, and you showed us an image of the schedules. Are there actually footnotes to these schedules as well?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because there are footnotes. There are lots of footnotes. And let me tell you, the work groups that work on these schedules, they toil over those footnotes to try to get them as clear as possible. And I'll tell you, as I was taught, there truly are pearls of wisdom in those footnotes. So when you download, you can download just the schedule itself, but you can also download a copy that has the footnotes with it for both the pediatric adolescent schedule and also for the adult schedule. And then there are laminated versions available with the footnotes. Now, I strongly encourage you when you're posting schedules for your staff that will be vaccinating people, that you post a copy that has the footnotes, and that when you're training people, that you orient them using not only the schedule but the footnotes, because a lot of questions that we get can be answered within those footnotes. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Donna. Here's a question that's to me, actually, so I'll take it. Are these slides listed in the pink book? And I can just say that generally some of the slides are, some of them are not. When something new happens, we might make a little update to the slide set. But these slides for the pink book webinar are going to be archived and available for future viewing. So you'll have another chance to look at these slide sets. We don't really make major changes. We try to stay as close as we can to the slide sets that are in the pink book. That's why we kind of do this webinar to go along with the pink book. You may notice some changes, but we will have these slides archived for later review as well. And I'll give you that information on kind of how to obtain that at the end of the presentation during my closed housekeeping slides. Donna, here's another question. Why does a newborn only receive the hepatitis B vaccine?
Well, the age indications are based on, when the manufacturers do their clinical trials and have the vaccine license, then it's indicated what is the minimum age that those vaccines can be given based on, primarily the safety data and efficacy data. Now, hepatitis B vaccine, it's important that that one is given at birth because that's often when the child can actually be exposed to the hepatitis B virus if it turns out that the mom is positive or if her status is unknown. So that birth dose is extremely important. And then for the other vaccines, again, it's based on the data from the clinical trials. And so for the majority of them, those vaccines, it's 6 weeks of age is the minimum age, unless we're talking about like the live virus vaccines.
Great, thank you. Here's a question about the rotavirus vaccine. If the rotavirus vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine, why is it indicated on the childhood vaccination schedule to be administered prior to 1 year of age, with consideration about maternal antibodies? Is it because the vaccine is an orally administered vaccine?
Well, yes, that's exactly the reason, because it is given orally. It's not affected by those maternal antibodies, so it it interacts with the immune system in a little bit different way in the gut. So that one is given before a year of age. Now, I mentioned during the presentation that there is an exception for MMR vaccine if a child's going to be, um, you know, traveling overseas, international travel because of the disease outbreak with measles. They have made a recommendation that those children could receive an MMR vaccine, or should, as early as 6 months of age, not before 6 months. The only thing to remember, though, is that dose will not count as one of their two what we call valid doses that they need. But it's important to go ahead, even if it might be affected by maternal antibodies. There's also the chance that it will, they will respond to it, and then it can give them protection if they're traveling internationally, because their risk is so much increased then for contracting measles. But routinely, if it's a parenteral vaccine and it's live attenuated, then it's not going to be given until a year of age, or like the nasal live attenuated, not until 2 years of age.
Great. Here's a question about the Tdap vaccine. Um, uh, do we recommend, or do we anticipate, or we foresee changes to the recommendations for Tdap vaccine for healthcare providers, such as a vaccination on a continuous cycle with Tdap?
Well, in terms of foreseeing a recommendation, I don't have a crystal ball or try to predict what ACIP will decide, but at this point, there's not been a recommendation. There's just not been strong enough data of its effectiveness and cost effectiveness for it to be administered more often, and it's only licensed for one dose for everyone except pregnant women. And actually, what I tried to point out when we were looking at one of those graphs, that the main reason that Tdap dose is recommended in every pregnancy is primarily to get those antibodies into that baby. For example, if a mom didn't get, or if she's, didn't get it during pregnancy, then unless she's never had a dose, we wouldn't recommend that she get a dose postpartum, because the whole reason during pregnancy is to get that dose in there, so that you can, because those IgG antibodies will pass through the placenta and provide protection to that baby until they, because those very, very young babies are the ones that are at greatest risk for severe complications, or hospitalization, or even death from pertussis. So trying to do everything we can to protect them until they can get enough DTaP vaccine in to give them that active immunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Donna. That's actually all the time we have for questions. Now I'm going to move on to some continuing education credit information. Please go to the webpage www.cdc.gov/TCE online to obtain credit. Today's live CE event course number is WC2645-060116. Please note that 060116 denotes today's date and differentiates this presentation from others in the series. CE credit for the live course will expire on July 5th, 2016. The course number for the Enduring Archive is WD2645-060116, and CE for the Enduring Archive is available until June 1st, 2018. You will also need the verification code, which is 2016-POV. And this verification code applies to both the live program and the Enduring program. And I will repeat the verification code, 2016-POV. For help with the online system, which is available from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, please dial 1-800-41-TRAIN. That corresponds to the phone number 1-800-418-7246. Or you can email ce@cdc.gov. You can email immunization questions to us if we did not get get to them today at nipinfo@cdc.gov, and we'll try to respond to those as quickly as possible. We also plan to post questions and answers we did not get to today at www.cdc.gov/vaccines/pinkbook/pb1.asp. That's the main registration. That's our main URL for this particular episode of the Pink Book webinar. You can also call immunization questions to us at 1-800-CDC-INFO or 1-800-232-4636 from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. Additional resources that you can use include the Pink Book, and the website for the Pink Book is www.cdc.gov/vaccines/pubs/pinkbook/index.html. It is available online, or you can purchase a hard copy at the link for the Public Health Foundation Learning Resource Center. Our CDC vaccine homepage is cdc.gov/vaccines/default.htm. Our resource guide for healthcare personnel entitled CDC Immunization Resources for You and Your Patients is listed at www.cdc.gov/vaccines/ed/imz-resources.pdf. Follow us on Twitter for immunization news, information, and resources for private and public healthcare personnel. That's at CDC-IZLearn on Twitter. So that concludes our program for today. I want to thank Ms. Donna Weaver for the presentation today, covering this topic in great detail, and for answering all of those questions that we received. Thank you very much, and have a great day from Atlanta. Goodbye.